The envelope had no return address. The man whose name was written inside had been dead for 3 years. Bumpy read it once, folded it. Then he sat very still. Chapter 1. The Envelope That Should Not Exist. There are things in Harlem that move quietly. Not fast, not loud, quietly. A word passed between two men at a counter. A nod across a barber shop. A folded piece of paper slipped beneath a door before the sun comes up. Harlem communicates in layers. And Bumpy Johnson understood every single one of them. Which is why, on a Tuesday morning that looked like every other Tuesday morning, when one of his men placed an envelope on the table in front of him, without a word, without even meeting his eyes, Bumpy noticed. Not the envelope. The silence around it. His man's name was Calvin, 32 years old. Broad shoulders, quiet mouth, steady hands. Calvin had been running messages, collecting numbers, and standing outside doors for Bumpy long enough to have seen things that would unsettle most men. He didn't rattle easily. But that morning, Calvin set the envelope down the way you set down something you are not sure is safe to hold. Bumpy looked at it. Then he looked at Calvin. Where did this come from? Calvin kept his eyes forward. Found it on the step, outside the back. No one on the street. Nothing on the camera. Bumpy didn't touch it yet. Who else has seen it? Just me. I brought it straight. Bumpy nodded once. That was enough. Calvin understood the nod. He stepped back, turned, and closed the door behind him without being asked. The room was a back office above a numbers parlor on 116th Street. Nothing grand about it. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that faced a brick wall. Bumpy liked it that way. The men who needed to find him knew where to find him. Everyone else didn't need to know. He sat alone with the envelope for a long moment. It was plain. White. And no postage, no return address. The kind of envelope you could buy in a bundle from any corner drugstore in the city. But on the back, written in blue ink, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the way a man writes when he knows the words matter, was a name, not Bumpy's name. The name of the man who sent it. And that name had no business being on anything new, because that name belonged to a dead man. Ellison Ray Carter. That was the name. Bumpy read it twice. Not because he doubted what he saw. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who doubted his own eyes. He read it twice because something in him needed a second count before he allowed himself to react. He set the envelope flat on the desk. He laced his fingers together. He sat back in the chair. Outside, Harlem was already running. The numbers were moving. The morning crowd was thick on Lenox Avenue. Women pushing strollers, old men with newspapers, children cutting through alleys on their way to school. The whole machinery of the neighborhood grinding forward the way it always did. Indifferent to anything happening above a parlor on 116th Street. Bumpy listened to it for a moment. Then he picked up the envelope. He did not open it immediately. That is important to understand about Elliot Ray Carter's name on that envelope. The shock was not the kind that makes a man gasp or stand up or knock something off a desk. The shock was internal, the kind that sits just behind the sternum and applies pressure. Bumpy had known Elliot Ray Carter for 11 years. He had attended the man's funeral 14 months prior. He had stood at the gravesite. He had watched the casket go into the ground. He had shaken the hand of Elliot's mother, a small woman named Ida, who wore a black hat with a veil, and gripped Bumpy's hand with both of hers and said, "He spoke well of you, Mr. Johnson. He always spoke well of you." Bumpy had told her, "He was a good man. Harlem is quieter without him." He had meant it. And now Elliot Ray Carter's name was on a fresh envelope that had appeared on the back step of his building before sunrise, with no postage, no explanation, and no logical reason to exist. He opened it. 1 page, folded in thirds. Blue ink. The same careful handwriting from the back of the envelope. Deliberate, unhurried, the penmanship of a man who had thought for a long time before he began to write. Bumpy read the first line. Then he stopped. He set the letter face down on the desk. He stood up, walked to the window, looked at the brick wall. He stood there for 40 seconds, maybe a minute. Then he walked back to the desk, sat down, turned the letter over, and read the rest. When Calvin knocked on the door 20 minutes later to ask if he needed anything, Bumpy's answer was measured. Get me some coffee, black, and tell whoever's downstairs that I don't want to be interrupted for the next hour. Calvin heard the tone, not anger, something steadier than anger, something that required more respect than anger. Yes, sir. The door closed again. Bumpy folded the letter along its original creases, placed it back inside the envelope, set the envelope in the center of the desk where he could see it clearly. Then he sat with it. Because whatever was written on that page had not come from nowhere. Letters don't write themselves. Dead men don't find envelopes. Someone had carried this across Harlem before the sun came up and set it on his step. That meant someone was still alive, who knew what this letter contained. And that changed everything about what the last 14 months had meant. The coffee came. Bumpy drank it slowly. He did not make any calls. He did not summon anyone. He simply sat in a back room above a numbers parlor on 116th Street, with a letter from a dead man in front of him. And he thought. Because that is what separated Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson from other men in his position. Not his reputation. Not his reach. Not the fear that his name could produce in the right circles. What separated him was this: the ability to sit completely still inside a moment that demanded urgency, and think it all the way through before he moved a single inch. Chapter 2. The Man Harlem. Already buried. Every neighborhood has its own kind of memory. Not the kind written in books or recorded in newspapers. The kind that lives in people. In the way a block goes quiet when a certain name gets mentioned. In the way older men look at each other across a table when someone brings up a story they all know, but nobody tells in full. Harlem's memory was long, and Elliot Ray Carter was part of it. He was not famous the way Bumpy was famous. He did not carry the weight of a name that preceded him into rooms. He did not have the kind of presence that made men straighten up when he walked through a door. Elliot Ray Carter was, by almost every visible measure, an ordinary man. Medium height, thin frame, a mustache he'd kept since his 20s, wore the same style of coat every winter, dark wool, single button at the collar, always slightly too big for him, as though he'd bought it in anticipation of a size he never quite reached. He worked officially as a bookkeeper. That was what the paperwork said. That was what he told his mother. That was what any city official who ever asked would have found on record. But in Harlem, in the actual Harlem, the one that breathed and moved and kept its own accounting, Elliot Ray Carter was something more precise than a bookkeeper. He was a keeper of information. Bumpy had found him in 1951, and not sought him out. Found him. The way you find a tool that turns out to be exactly right for a job you've been doing wrong for years. Elliot had been running small numbers for a man named Dees on the west side of the neighborhood. Nothing significant. Pocket money, mostly. But what Bumpy noticed, what one of his lieutenants brought to his attention, was the way Elliot managed the records. Clean, layered, structured in a way that made the money look like something else entirely, without a single obvious falsification. Not many men could do that. Most men in that world either kept sloppy records or kept obvious ones. Elliot kept records that were a kind of art form, accurate enough to satisfy the right people, invisible enough to protect the wrong ones. Bumpy had him brought in. Not with pressure, with a meal. They sat across from each other at a restaurant on 7th Avenue. Then and Bumpy asked him one question. Who taught you to think like that? Elliot had looked at him without flinching, which itself told Bumpy something, and said, nobody. I just always understood that numbers are a language. And like any language, you can say the same thing two different ways, depending on who's listening. Bumpy had nodded. Come work for me. It was not a question, but it was not a threat either. It was an offer made with the full weight of what that offer meant in Harlem in 1951. Elliot said yes. For 9 years, Elliot Ray Carter sat at the center of Bumpy's financial infrastructure the way a spine sits at the center of a body. Invisible. Essential. Holding everything upright. He knew the flow of every dollar that moved through Bumpy's operation. He knew which fronts were clean and which were carrying weight. So he knew the names behind the names. The men who appeared nowhere on paper but collected a percentage of everything that moved through the neighborhood. He knew more about Bumpy's world than almost anyone alive. And in 9 years, he never once spoke out of turn, Not to rivals, not to the police, not to the federal agents who twice brought him into rooms and asked him questions they hoped would lead somewhere useful. Both times, my Elliot sat across from men in suits who believed that the right amount of pressure applied to a thin man with a bookkeeper's title would produce results. Both times, he looked at them with the same mild expression he wore everywhere, patient, unreadable, quietly amused, and told them nothing. He came home, called Bumpy's man, passed along the list of questions they had asked, and went back to work. Bumpy trusted very few people completely. That is not a character flaw, and that is a survival requirement for any man who operates at a certain level for a certain length of time. Trust in that world is not given. It is constructed, brick by brick, year by year, test by test. Elliot had passed every test, not through bold gestures or declarations of loyalty, through consistency, through the quiet accumulation of right decisions made over nearly a decade in circumstances that offered easier, more profitable wrong ones. That kind of trust, once built, does not sit lightly. When Elliot died, officially from a heart attack, in the back of a cab on a wet November night in 1962, Bumpy received the news the way men of his composition receive most news, still, inward, privately. He did not show grief in rooms where grief could be read as weakness, but those closest to him, the men who had known him long enough to understand the architecture of his silences, noticed a change in the days that followed. He was quieter than usual, and he canceled 2 meetings. He spent an afternoon at the gravesite before the service, alone, before the family arrived. He did not explain any of it. He didn't need to. The funeral had been a proper one. Ida Carter, Elliot's mother, 71 years old, a woman who had come up from Georgia in her 20s and built a life in Harlem through a combination of faith, stubbornness, and refusal to be diminished by anything the city threw at her, had arranged everything with the kind of quiet precision her son had inherited. Good flowers, the right church, a choir that actually sang rather than performed. The neighborhood came out. Not in the dramatic way it turns out for men, whose deaths arrive violently and publicly. In the quieter way it turns out for men who serve the community without requiring the community to know they were doing it. People who had never spoken Elliot's name above a murmur stood in the pews because they had benefited from his work without ever being told the specifics. Because in Harlem, people understand, even when they don't understand exactly. They feel the shape of a thing without being given the details. Elliot Ray Carter had kept things running that needed to keep running, and on some level, the neighborhood knew it. Bumpy stood in the second row. He wore a dark suit, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him. He listened to the words the Reverend said and measured them against the man he knew. They were true enough. They just weren't complete. But that was the nature of funerals. You bury the version of the man that the world is allowed to know. The rest goes into the ground with him. Or so Bumpy had believed. 14 months. That was how long Elliot Ray Carter had been in the ground when the envelope arrived on the back step. The 14 months of closed accounts and settled ledgers and the kind of quiet that follows when a chapter ends cleanly. Bumpy had redistributed Elliot's responsibilities carefully. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. The way a man handles an estate when he respects the person who left it. He had considered Elliot's chapter finished. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but finished. And now the envelope sat on the desk in the back room on 116th Street. Thus, and nothing about Elliot Ray Carter's chapter was finished at all, because dead men do not write letters, which meant one of 2 things. Either the letter had been written before Elliot died, prepared, sealed, and given to someone with instructions to deliver it at a specific moment, or Elliot Ray Carter's death was not what Bumpy had been told it was. Either answer was serious. Either answer changed the shape of the last 14 months entirely. Either answer meant that somewhere inside Bumpy's world, inside the tight, carefully constructed inner ring of people he had allowed himself to trust, something had gone unseen. And for a man whose reputation rested as much on what he knew as what he did, that was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that required complete stillness before a single move, which is exactly what Bumpy gave it. Chapter 3. What the letter said. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when he reads something that rearranges the furniture of everything he thought he knew. Not the silence of confusion, not the silence of fear. The silence of a man whose mind is moving very fast inside a body that has gone completely still. That was the silence that filled the back room on 116th Street as Bumpy read Elliot Ray Carter's letter for the second time. And then the third. The letter was not long. That was the first thing that struck him about it. A man who had carried the weight Elliot carried. 9 years inside the most sensitive infrastructure of Bumpy's operation. 9 years of numbers and names and layered ledgers and federal interrogations survived with his mouth shut. A man like that, sitting down to write what may have been the most important letter of his life, had chosen brevity. 1 page, 11 paragraphs. Now, in some of them, only a sentence long. There was no greeting, no dear Bumpy, no formal opening. It began the way a man begins a conversation that has been going on inside his head for a very long time and has finally been allowed out. It began with an admission. There is something you were never told about the night Marcus Hale died. That was the first line. Bumpy read it the first time and set the letter face down on the desk, stood up, walked to the window. He already knew what this was going to cost him. Not because he knew what came next, because he knew what that name meant. Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale had been dead for 3 years before Elliot. He had been, on the surface, a mid-level operator, a man who ran a section of the numbers in the upper part of the neighborhood, collected his percentage, stayed out of politics, and presented himself as someone who understood his place in the larger order of things. He had died on a Tuesday night in an alley off 123rd Street. The official story, the one that moved through Harlem in the days following, the one that settled into the neighborhood's memory and calcified there, was that Marcus Hale had been killed over a debt, a gambling debt specifically, owed to men who had grown tired of waiting for it. The case had not been aggressively investigated by anyone with a badge. Men like Marcus Hale died in alleys off 123rd Street, with a frequency that the city had long since decided was beneath the threshold of serious inquiry. A file was opened, a file was closed, the neighborhood moved on. Bumpy had accepted the story, not because he was careless, because the story had come from sources he considered reliable, because it carried the internal logic that these things usually carry. Because nothing in the weeks before Marcus Hale's death had given him reason to look at it differently. He had accepted it, and he had been wrong to. That was what Elliot's letter was telling him. He walked back to the desk, sat down, turned the letter over, and read. Elliot wrote carefully, without melodrama, the way he had always done everything, with the precision of a man who understood that clarity is its own form of respect. He wrote that on the night Marcus Hale died, he had been present, not in the alley, not as a participant, but close enough that he had seen something that did not match the story that later circulated. He had been in a car parked on 123rd Street, waiting for a man who owed him a private debt unrelated to Bumpy's business. He had been there early. The street had been quiet. He had seen 2 men walk Marcus Hale into that alley. He knew both of them, not as strangers, not as distant figures on the periphery of the neighborhood, as men inside Bumpy's circle. Elliot did not give their names immediately. That was deliberate. Bumpy could feel the deliberateness of it in the structure of the letter, the way Elliot had arranged the information, the way you arrange a room before you invite someone into it. Context first. Names second. Evidence last. He wrote that he had sat in that car for 20 minutes after what he had seen, trying to decide what to do. He wrote that he had almost come to Bumpy that same night. No, he wrote that he had not, and then he wrote why. Because one of the men I saw was someone you loved like a brother, and I did not know then, and I'm still not certain now, whether telling you would have protected you or destroyed something in you that I did not have the right to destroy. Bumpy stopped, read that sentence again, set the letter down flat on the desk with his palm on top of it. He breathed. Once. Twice. Nay, he did not allow himself to move past that sentence until he had felt the full weight of it, and then set the weight to one side. Because if he let himself feel it completely in that moment, it would interfere with his ability to read the rest clearly. and he needed to read the rest clearly. He lifted his palm, continued. Elliot wrote that he had made the decision to stay silent, not out of cowardice, and he was clear about that, in the careful way that he was clear about everything. He wrote that a man who had survived 2 federal interrogations without flinching was not writing this letter as an apology for being afraid. He wrote that he had stayed silent because he had watched Bumpy carry the weight of Harlem for years, because he had watched the cost of that, the sleeplessness, the discipline, the constant management of a world that was always one wrong decision away from falling apart. And he had decided, on his own authority, and that the truth about Marcus Hale was a weight that Bumpy did not need, added to the rest. He had decided to carry it himself. He had carried it for 3 years. And then, something had changed. He wrote that in the months before his death. And here the letter shifted slightly, the handwriting tightening, becoming more compressed. And yet the way handwriting changes when the body writing it is under internal pressure. He had become aware that the man he had protected with his silence was not finished, that Marcus Hale had not been the only one, that what he had witnessed in that alley was not an isolated act of violence born from one bad night. It was a pattern, and the pattern was still moving. I am writing this because I am not well, and because I have decided that protecting you from a truth is not the same as being loyal to you. Real loyalty tells the man the thing he needs to know, even when it is the hardest thing to say. The name you need is, and there it stopped. Not because the letter ended naturally, because the bottom of the page had been torn, not cut. Torn, quickly, unevenly, the way paper tears when a hand moves in a hurry or under duress. The name was gone. Bumpy sat with that for a long moment. And he turned the page over, examined the tear, looked inside the envelope a second time, slowly, pressing the corners open to make certain nothing had been folded small and missed. Nothing. He set the envelope down. He looked at the ceiling. And then, for the first time since Calvin had placed this envelope in front of him, hours ago, something shifted in Bumpy's expression. Not anger, not grief. Something colder than both. Understanding. The letter had been written by a dying man, prepared in advance, given to someone with instructions to deliver it. But the name, the one name the entire letter had been building toward, had been removed before it arrived, which meant someone had intercepted it. Someone had read it. Someone had made a deliberate decision to let Bumpy receive the confession but not the conclusion. They wanted him to know that he had been blind. They did not want him to know to whom. That was not an accident. That was a message. And whoever had sent it understood exactly what they were doing. They were not trying to protect a name. They were trying to watch what Bumpy did when he had enough information to be dangerous, but not enough to be precise. They were measuring him. Bumpy folded the letter along its original creases, placed it back in the envelope, placed the envelope inside his jacket, against his chest, stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room, not fast, not with visible urgency. The way a man walks when he has decided something, and the decision is going to take as long as it takes, and there is no point in rushing what must be done correctly. Chapter 4. The Name. Behind the name. There are moments in a man's life when everything that came before gets re-examined. Not voluntarily, not as an exercise in reflection or wisdom, but because something has arrived that makes the past look different. Like a light shifted in a room you thought you knew completely. Suddenly the shadows fall in new places. Suddenly the corners you trusted look like corners you should have watched more carefully. Bumpy walked out of that back room carrying one of those moments inside his jacket. He did not go far. He came downstairs, moved through the parlor without stopping, nodded once at the 2 men near the front who straightened when they saw him, and stepped outside onto 116th Street. He stood on the sidewalk, let the neighborhood move around him. Harlem in the middle of the day was its own kind of noise, not chaos, but density. Voices layering over each other, radios from open windows, the smell of food from the restaurant 2 doors down, children cutting past adults who barely registered them. the whole living weight of the neighborhood, going about its business under a pale winter sky. Bumpy stood in the middle of it and let it settle over him like a coat. He needed to think, not in the abstract way, in the specific, practical, no surgical way that the situation required. Because the letter had given him a shape without a face, a crime without a name, a confession that had been deliberately amputated before it could identify anyone. That was a problem. But it was also, if approached correctly, a path. He started with what he knew. Elliot had seen two men walk Marcus Hale into that alley. Both men were inside Bumpy's circle. One of them, Elliot had written, was someone Bumpy loved like a brother, and that was the phrase that required the most careful handling. Not because it was vague, but because it was not. Elliot was not a man who used language loosely. Every word in that letter had been chosen. Loved like a brother was not a flourish. It was a coordinate. Bumpy stood on 116th Street and quietly, without expression, began to count. The men inside his inner circle were not many. That was intentional. Bumpy had always kept the center small, not out of distrust of any individual, but out of respect for the mathematics of secrecy. Every additional person inside the center was an additional variable, and additional variables produced additional risk. He could name them without effort. Calvin, his primary man. 14 years. Steady as any man he had ever known. But Calvin had been a boy when Marcus Hale died, still building himself. Not yet the man who stood outside that door and set envelopes on desks without a word. There was Reginald, older, a man who had been beside Bumpy since before Harlem fully understood what Bumpy was becoming. A man who had stood with him through pressures that had dismantled lesser arrangements. Reginald, who had a laugh that filled a room and a loyalty that had never once produced a reason to question it. There was Solomon Price, quiet man, handled specific matters that required a particular combination of intelligence and discretion, had been inside the circle for 7 years, and came with credentials that Bumpy had verified personally. There was DeWitt, older still, semi-retired from active involvement, but present at the table for decisions that required historical context. A man who remembered everything, who had known Bumpy's world before Bumpy had fully built it. And there was one more, the one Bumpy's mind moved toward and then moved away from. The way a tongue moves toward a broken tooth and then pulls back from the pain of confirming it. His name was Raymond Earl Duckett, but no one called him Raymond. No one called him Earl. Everyone called him Deuce. Deuce had been beside Bumpy for longer than almost anyone. Not as a lieutenant, not as muscle, as something closer and harder to define. A companion in the original sense of the word. A man who had shared the same table, the same risks, the same losses, across a span of time that constituted most of Bumpy's adult life in Harlem. They had come up together, not from the same place. Deuce was from Baltimore originally, had come to New York at 19 with nothing but the particular sharpness that certain kinds of difficult childhoods produce in certain kinds of men. But they had found each other early, in the way that men who are built for the same world find each other, and they had recognized something, a parallel structure, a similar architecture of principle. Deuce was not a violent man by preference. He was strategic. He thought in sequences, in consequences, in the long game that most men in their world either couldn't see or couldn't sustain the patience for. He was also, in Bumpy's private accounting, the closest thing he had to a peer. Not an employee, not a subordinate, a peer. The kind of man you did not merely trust. You trusted his judgment. You trusted his read of situations. Now you trusted the version of events he brought to you, because you had tested it against reality enough times to know it arrived clean. Bumpy loved Deuce like a brother, and Elliot Ray Carter had known that. He did not move toward the conclusion immediately. That is the discipline. That is the thing that separates men who survive long tenures in dangerous positions from men who do not. The ability to hold a possibility, even a devastating one, at arm's length, to examine it from a distance before allowing it to become a conviction. Conviction without evidence is not strength. It is the illusion of strength, and it produces the kind of damage that cannot be undone. Bumpy had seen men destroy loyal relationships because they had confused suspicion with certainty, had watched friendships of decades dissolve over accusations that turned out to be the product of someone else's maneuvering. They had watched those same men spend the rest of their lives unable to rebuild what they had broken in a moment of unexamined certainty. He was not going to be that. So he held Deuce's name to one side and kept moving. He thought about the tier, the bottom of the page, removed deliberately, the name taken out before the letter was delivered. Who had access to that letter between Elliot's hands and Bumpy's desk? Elliot had written it in advance. Had given it to someone. A person trusted enough to carry a dead man's most dangerous secret across Harlem without opening it. Except someone had opened it and then resealed it, or not bothered resealing it, knowing that the missing page would communicate its own message. That someone was either the person Elliot had entrusted with the letter, or someone who had gotten to that person first. Bumpy came back inside. He went upstairs, sat down at the desk again. He did not call a meeting, did not summon his men, did not make the kind of visible moves that signal to a room that something has shifted. He did what he always did when he needed to understand a situation without alerting the situation that it was being understood. He watched. Over the next 2 days, Bumpy moved through his normal rhythms with deliberate precision. He kept his appointments. He took his meals at the usual places. He was present at the table for the usual conversations. He listened more than he spoke, which was not unusual for him, but he listened now with a different instrument, not for information, but for dissonance, for the small misalignments between what men said and what their bodies were doing while they said it. He was looking for the man who already knew about the letter, because someone did. The letter had been tampered with before it reached him. That meant at least one person in his world was aware that it had arrived, was watching to see how Bumpy absorbed it, was perhaps in that very room on those very 2 days, sitting across a table from Bumpy and measuring his composure the way Bumpy was measuring theirs. It was on the second evening that something caught his attention. Not a dramatic reveal, not a confession, not a visible crack in anyone's armor. Something smaller. Deuce had asked him, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about a numbers dispute on the West Side, a question that had nothing to do with numbers disputes. Then he had asked it casually, dropped it into the conversation the way you drop a coin into a pocket, quickly, without ceremony, trying not to draw attention to the action. You heard anything unusual lately? Anybody coming to you with old business? Old business. Bumpy had looked at him, not with accusation, not with the kind of look that signals a relationship has just changed. With the same steady level gaze he gave every man in every room. Nothing I can't handle, Bumpy said. Deuce nodded. Moved on? The conversation continued, but the question sat in the air between them long after the words had passed. Old business. Elliot Ray Carter had been dead for 14 months. Marcus Hale had been dead for 3 years before that. And Deuce had just used the exact phrase, unprompted, casually, without apparent reason, that described both of them perfectly. Bumpy did not react. He finished the conversation, shook hands, watched Deuce leave the room. Then he sat down, and for the first time since the envelope had arrived on his back step, something in him shifted from analysis into something quieter and more absolute. Not anger, not grief, though there was grief underneath it. The way there is always grief underneath the recognition that something you built with someone has a different foundation than you believed. Certainty. Quiet, cold, irrevocable certainty. He did not have the name from the letter, but he had something the letter could never have given him. He had watched the man reveal himself, and now everything that followed would be decided not by fury, not by speed, not by the kind of response that the street expected from a man in Bumpy's position. It would be decided by patience, by the same discipline that had built everything Bumpy Johnson had ever built, by the understanding that the most powerful move available to him was also the slowest one. And that slowness, in the right hands, was not weakness. It was the most devastating thing in the world. Chapter 5. Bumpy doesn't move fast. There's a particular kind of fear that spreads through a room when a powerful man does nothing. Not the fear of a raised voice, not the fear of visible anger, not the fear that comes when a man slams a door or overturns a table, or makes the kind of scene that announces itself clearly. The other kind, the fear that settles in slowly, like cold air under a door. The fear that comes when a man who has every reason to move stays completely still. When a man who everyone in the room knows has seen something, heard something, understood something, simply continues eating, continues speaking, continues being present in all the ordinary ways, as though nothing has changed. That is the fear that Bumpy Johnson now allowed to do its work. He did not confront Deuce, not that day, not the day after. He let a week pass, in 7 days in which everything on the surface of his world continued exactly as it always had. The numbers moved, the meetings happened, the meals were taken at the usual tables in the usual restaurants with the usual men, conversations about the neighborhood, about disputes, about the quiet pressures that were always present at a certain level of operation, all of it continued at its normal rhythm. Bumpy moved through it with the same composure he always carried. But inside that composure, behind those steady eyes that had always been the feature men remembered most about him, not his size, not his reputation, not the stories that circulated about what he had done in moments of crisis. Behind all of that, a precise and unhurried process was underway. He was building a complete picture. He started with Marcus Hale, not with who killed him, with why. Because the why, Bumpy understood, was the foundation everything else rested on. Violence without motive is chaos. Violence with motive is architecture. And if what Eliot's letter suggested was true, that Marcus Hale's death was not a settling of a gambling debt, but a deliberate act by men inside Bumpy's circle, then the motive was the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. He went back through 3 years of memory, methodically, without rushing, the way a man goes back through old ledgers, looking for the error that produced a number that never quite balanced. What had Marcus Hale known? And what had Marcus Hale been close to, seen, overheard, or been positioned to understand in the weeks before his death? And as Bumpy moved backward through that terrain, something began to emerge. Not a revelation, a pattern, the quiet kind, the kind that only becomes visible when you know what you're looking for. Marcus Hale had been, in the months before his death, handling a specific segment of the operation that ran through the northern edge of the neighborhood. Now, nothing sensitive on its face. Collection routes, standard distribution of numbers proceeds. The ordinary machinery of the work. But northern edge of the neighborhood meant a specific set of blocks, and those blocks, in the months preceding Marcus Hale's death, had been the subject of a quiet territorial conversation. Not a war, not an open conflict, but the kind of low-level negotiation that happens when money and geography overlap in ways that require management. And Bumpy had handled that negotiation himself, directly, with the kind of personal attention he gave to situations that had the potential to become larger than they appeared. The negotiation had concluded smoothly, or so he had believed. He had believed it because the man he trusted to give him the final read on the situation, the man whose assessment he had accepted as definitive, was Deuce. Bumpy sat with that for a long time. He did not allow himself to move past it quickly, so he owed the truth of it more than that. Deuce had given him a clean bill on a situation that, if Marcus Hale had been allowed to continue operating in it, might have produced a very different outcome, might have produced information that traveled upward, might have produced a conversation between Marcus Hale and Bumpy that Deuce could not have controlled or predicted or managed. Marcus Hale had not been killed because of a gambling debt. Marcus Hale had been killed because of what he was positioned to see. And the gambling debt story, clean, plausible, internally consistent, The exact kind of story that settles into a neighborhood's memory without resistance had come, in its details, from sources that traced back to Dooch. Not directly. Nothing in Deuce's world was ever direct. That was the architecture of the man. Layers, distance, plausible separation between himself and the thing he had caused. But there it was, 3 years later, assembled slowly in the back rooms of Bumpy's own memory. He thought about Elliot. Elliot, who had sat in a parked car on 123rd Street and watched two men walk Marcus Hale into an alley, who had recognized both of them, who had spent 3 years carrying that knowledge like a stone in his chest. Elliot, who had protected Bumpy from it, not out of complicity, but out of a particular kind of love. The love that tries to shield the person it is aimed at from damage, even at the cost of the truth. Bumpy did not judge him for that. He understood it. He even, in the quiet of his own accounting, honored it. But he also understood that Elliot's silence had given Deuce 3 years of continued access. 3 years of continued trust. 3 years of sitting at Bumpy's table and looking him in the eye across the architecture of a lie that had cost a man his life. And then Elliot had gotten sick. And somewhere in the approach of his own death, he had decided that the stone he had been carrying was not his to take into the ground. He had written the letter. He had given it to someone. And then someone had gotten to it first. That someone. Bumpy had been moving around the edges of that question all week. Who had Elliot trusted with the letter? The answer, when it arrived, came not through investigation, but through memory, through the particular kind of recall that surfaces when a man stops trying to force it and simply allows the mind to move at its own pace. Elliot had a nephew, young man, 24, 25 years old, named Curtis, worked at a dry goods store on Lenox Avenue. Quiet kid, kept to himself, had been close to his uncle in the way that certain young men are close to an older relative who represents a version of the world they are still trying to understand. Bumpy had met Curtis twice, both times at Elliot's side. Both times the young man had been respectful, attentive, careful in the way his uncle had trained him to be. Elliot would have trusted Curtis with the letter. And Curtis, 24, 25 years old, working at a dry goods store, not built for the world his uncle had navigated for 9 years. Curtis would have been easy to get to, not with violence, with the right kind of pressure, with the suggestion delivered by the right person in the right tone that some things are better left incomplete, that a young man's future is a fragile thing, that the wisest course for everyone involved was to let the letter arrive with certain parts of it missing. Bumpy picked up the telephone. He called one number, not Deuce's number, not anyone inside the inner circle, an older man, a retired man, someone who existed entirely outside the current infrastructure, but who had been, decades earlier, present at the construction of it, and a man who owed Bumpy a debt of the kind that doesn't appear on any ledger, but is never forgotten by either party. His name was not important to the street. His access to certain memories was. Bumpy spoke for less than 3 minutes. He asked 2 questions. He listened to the answers. He said, "Thank you. We don't need to speak about this again." He hung up. He sat back. The second question he had asked was about Deuce. Specifically, how about a period 18 months ago, after Marcus Hale had been dead for 18 months after the story had settled, after no one was looking at it anymore, during which Deuce had made a series of quiet financial movements. Modest amounts, the kind of amounts that don't attract attention, moving through channels that Elliot himself had originally designed, the kind of movements that only make sense if someone is paying for continued silence, paying Curtis, or paying whoever else had been positioned to know. The old man on the phone had confirmed it, not with certainty, with the kind of careful, qualified veteran's confirmation that translates, in practice, to certainty. It was enough. That evening, Bumpy and Deuce sat together for dinner. The same restaurant they had been eating at together for years. Same table. Same waiter who knew their order without being told. Same easy familiarity of two men who had shared enough history to move through a meal without needing to fill every silence. Bumpy was composed, warm even in the way he could be warm. Not performatively, but in the genuine ease of a man comfortable in his own skin in a room that presented him no threat. They talked about the neighborhood, about a young man on the west side who was showing promise, about the weather turning, about a restaurant on 125th Street that one of them had heard good things about. Deuce was composed too, but Bumpy watched, and Deuce, beneath the composure, beneath the ease and the familiar rhythm of two men who had shared a table 1,000 times, Deuce was working to read Bumpy, working to determine what Bumpy knew and how much, and whether the careful architecture he had maintained for 3 years was still standing. Bumpy could see it, not in anything dramatic, nor in the small recalibrations, the fraction of a second delays between hearing a sentence and responding to it, while the mind behind the eyes runs the response through a filter it doesn't normally need. Deuce was not at ease. He was performing ease. And the performance, to anyone who had watched the original long enough, had a seam. Toward the end of the meal, Bumpy set down his fork, folded his hands on the table in front of him, looked at Deuce with the full, level, so undecorated attention that in all their years together had always meant that what followed was the only thing in the room that mattered. Deuce felt it. Bumpy watched him feel it. He let the silence sit for a long moment. Then he asked his question. One question. Not about Marcus Hale. Not about the letter. Not about Curtis or the financial movements or the 3 years of carefully maintained distance between Deuce and what Deuce had done. He asked something much simpler. Are you the same man you were when I met you? The table went quiet. The restaurant around them continued. Forks, voices, the low music from somewhere in the back. But the table went quiet in a way that exists outside of sound. Deuce looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, brief enough that a less careful observer would have missed it entirely, something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Guilt is too simple a word for what passed through Deuce's face in that fraction of a second. Recognition. The recognition of a man who understands, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that the conversation he has been dreading for 3 years has finally arrived. That the careful structure he has maintained is not going to be dismantled with accusations or confrontation or visible anger. It is going to be dismantled with a question. One quiet, devastating, unanswerable question from a man sitting across a dinner table with his hands folded and his eyes completely still. Douche opened his mouth, closed it, then said very quietly, "I'd like to think so." Bumpy nodded once, slowly. The way a judge nods when a verdict has been delivered that confirms what the evidence already established. He picked up his fork, finished his meal, and said nothing else for the rest of the evening. Because the answer to, "I'd like to think so," is not a response. It is a confession. And Bumpy Johnson had just heard everything he needed to hear. Not in anger, not with violence, not with the kind of confrontation that empties rooms and ends careers, in a single loud moment, with one question, and a silence that carried more consequence than anything that could have followed it. Chapter 6. What the Dead Leave Behind. There is a question that follows every man who operates at a certain level for a certain length of time. Not asked out loud, not by enemies, not by the law, asked internally, in the quiet hours, in the spaces between decisions. What will remain when I'm gone? Not money, not territory, not the fear that a name can generate in the right rooms. Something more durable than all of that. The answer to that question is legacy. And legacy in Harlem was not built in moments of power. It was built in moments of restraint, and in the decisions a man made when every instinct available to him pointed toward destruction, and he chose instead something harder and more lasting. Bumpy Johnson had always understood that. What the letter from Elliot Ray Carter had done, what the dead man had set in motion from beyond the grave, with one incomplete page and one torn edge, was force that understanding into its most difficult test. He did not move against Deuce immediately. A week passed after the dinner. Then 2. No, the neighborhood continued. The numbers ran. The meetings happened. The ordinary machinery of Bumpy's world turned at its usual pace, and from the outside, from any vantage point available to anyone who was not inside Bumpy's own thinking, nothing had changed. That was intentional, because Bumpy was not finished building the picture. He knew what Deuce had done. He knew why. He had enough to act on in the way that men in his position traditionally acted on certainty of that kind. But knowing and understanding are two different instruments, and Bumpy needed to understand before he moved. Not just what Deuce had done, what Deuce had become, how long the becoming had been happening, and whether the man who had arrived at the decision to order Marcus Hale's death had always carried that capacity quietly inside him, or whether something had changed him along the way. That distinction mattered to Bumpy, not for Deuce's sake, for his own. He found Curtis, Elliot's nephew, now the young man from the dry goods store on Lenox Avenue. He did not send anyone. He went himself. On a Wednesday afternoon, dressed in nothing that announced him, moving through the neighborhood the way he had always been able to move, when he chose not to be Bumpy Johnson for a few hours, and simply be a man walking through Harlem. Curtis was behind the counter when Bumpy came in. He recognized him immediately. The recognition produced exactly what Bumpy expected, a visible contraction, in the body pulling inward slightly, the eyes going careful. Bumpy picked up a small item from the nearest shelf, set it on the counter. How much? Curtis told him. Bumpy paid, pocketed the item, did not move toward the door. He looked at the young man for a moment, quietly, without threat, with the particular quality of attention that communicated, without a word being spoken, that what was about to happen was a conversation and not an interrogation. Your uncle was a good man, Bumpy said. Curtis nodded. His jaw was tight. He spoke well of you, Bumpy continued. Told me once that you had his eyes. Said it like a compliment.